In the year 1443, a woman named Jehanne stood before the Echevins of Dijon, accused of practicing her trade outside the city's official brothel. Her punishment would be public humiliation, expulsion, and the permanent marking of her body, a sentence that reveals how medieval cities regulated, exploited, and attempted to contain women who sold sex for survival. This is not a story found in illuminated manuscripts or sung by troubadours. It survives instead in civic registers, court testimonies, municipal ordinances, and the careful accounting ledgers of towns across France, Italy, the Low Countries, and England. Between the 12th and 15th centuries, prostitution was neither hidden nor romanticized. It was legislated, taxed, zoned, and justified through an uneasy marriage of Christian theology and urban pragmatism. The women who sold sex occupied a position both necessary and despised, their bodies rendered public property through law, while their voices remained largely unrecorded. What follows is an examination of that world, the economic forces that drove women into the trade, the legal and religious systems that simultaneously condemned and controlled them, and the everyday violence, indignity, and rare moments of agency that defined their existence. The framework that allowed medieval cities to regulate prostitution without moral collapse came from the Church itself. St. Augustine, writing in the 4th century, had argued that removing prostitution from society would unleash chaos, likening it to removing a sewer from a palace. The structure might appear cleaner, he wrote, but the resulting contamination would be far worse. Thomas Aquinas repeated this reasoning in the 13th century, and by the time of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the doctrine was firmly established. Fornication remained a sin, but prostitution was acknowledged as a necessary evil, a social drainage system that prevented greater sexual disorder and protected the virtue of respectable women. This theological compromise did not emerge from compassion. It emerged from fear of rape, sodomy, adultery, and the collapse of the marriage economy that structured medieval property and inheritance. The women who absorbed this moral pollution were deemed corrupted, yet their work was understood as service, however degraded. This logic had immediate material consequences. By the 13th century, cities across southern France, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire began establishing regulated brothels. Avignon, Toulouse, Montpellier, Marseille, and Arles each operated municipal lupanars, houses of prostitution leased to private keepers who paid fees to the town council. Venice created a magistracy known as the Signori de Notte to oversee prostitution, designating specific neighborhoods and issuing licenses. In London, the Southwark stews operated under the authority of the Bishop of Winchester, a lucrative arrangement that persisted from the 12th through the 16th centuries. These were not underground enterprises. They were civic institutions, part of the infrastructure of urban life, as much as granaries, markets, and hospitals. Yet regulation required visibility, and visibility required marking. Across medieval Europe, sumptuary laws forced prostitutes to wear distinctive clothing. In Avignon, a yellow hood. In Florence, gloves and bells. In Toulouse, a white stripe on the shoulder. The colors and symbols varied, but the purpose remained constant: to render the prostitute identifiable at a glance, to separate her from respectable women, and to make enforcement possible. These laws were not symbolic gestures. Women caught working without the required markers faced fines, imprisonment, or public whipping. In some cities, repeat offenders had their noses slit or were branded. The marking transformed the body itself into a legal document, readable by anyone with knowledge of local ordinance. The women who entered this trade rarely did so by choice, if choice can be said to exist under conditions of hunger and abandonment. The Black Death of 1348 created waves of displacement. Families shattered by plague, famine, or war left young women without kinship networks, without dowries, without access to guilds that controlled most urban labor. Widows without property or male relatives turned to prostitution when domestic service could not be found. Fathers sold daughters to brothel keepers to settle debts. Women fled rural poverty for towns, only to discover that work for women without protection was scarce, poorly paid, and often involved the same bodily transactions they had hoped to avoid. The medieval economy offered women few paths. Marriage required a dowry. Wage labor in textiles or domestic service paid a fraction of what men earned. The church required a dowry even for most convents. Prostitution, for many, was not a moral failing but the last option in a narrowing field. Once in the trade, women entered systems designed to extract profit and enforce control. Brothel keepers, both male and female, held power through debt bondage. A woman might be told she owed money for food, for clothing, for her bed, and that she could not leave until the debt was paid. The debt, of course, was never paid. Pimps operated openly in some cities, collecting a portion of earnings in exchange for nominal protection. In practice, this protection was often from the pimp himself. Violence structured the trade at every level. Clients assaulted women with little fear of legal consequence. A prostitute's testimony carried almost no weight in medieval courts. Brothel keepers beat women who attempted to leave or who withheld earnings. Civic authorities flogged women found working outside designated zones. Pregnancy was common, and childbirth was dangerous. Infanticide, while criminalized, appears repeatedly in court records as a desperate response to an impossible situation. The women themselves remain elusive. Most left no written testimony. What survives are the words of men, judges, legislators, moralists, and physicians. The records describe fines levied, clothing violations punished, bodies found in rivers. Occasionally a name surfaces. Jehan of Dijon, Marotte Le Bouchier of Paris, Alison of Southwark, but their voices, their thoughts, the small strategies of survival and resistance they employed, these are largely lost. What can be reconstructed is the machinery that surrounded them, the laws that defined them, and the economic and theological logic that rendered their exploitation not only permissible but necessary. The trade was not static. It responded to war, plague, economic cycles, and shifts in religious sentiment. The late 15th century brought new pressures. The disease later called syphilis appeared in the 1490s, spreading rapidly and associated, fairly or not, with prostitution. Civic moralism intensified. Humanist reformers and religious preachers called for the closure of brothels. One by one, cities began shutting their municipal houses of prostitution. In 1561, the Parliament of Paris ordered all brothels in France closed. The women who had worked within legal frameworks were now criminalized, driven into clandestine work with even less protection than before. What follows in this account is an attempt to see past the moralizing and the silence, to examine the structures that shaped these lives and the lived experience that those structures produced. It begins with theology, not because theology determined reality, but because it provided the intellectual architecture that allowed medieval society to justify what it was already doing. From there, the story moves through poverty and coercion, through regulation and marking, through violence and exploitation, through the rare paths toward escape, and finally through the spaces where the trade occurred, the brothels, the taverns, the alleyways, and the edges of towns where law met lawlessness. The sources are fragmentary and hostile. The women who appear in them are almost always seen through the eyes of those who prosecuted, fined, or condemned them. Yet even in these constrained records, patterns emerge. Patterns of survival, of resistance, and of the stubborn persistence of human beings, navigating a world that offered them almost nothing and demanded nearly everything. The intellectual foundation for medieval Europe's treatment of prostitution rested on a theological paradox. Christian doctrine held fornication to be a mortal sin, yet the same tradition that condemned sexual commerce also argued for its toleration. This was not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It was a calculated compromise, rooted in the writings of church fathers and scholastic theologians who believed that attempting to suppress prostitution entirely would unleash worse evils. The logic was pragmatic, even cynical. Better to contain and regulate vice than to risk the collapse of social order. The doctrine of necessary evil, as it came to be known, provided the moral architecture that allowed medieval society to condemn prostitutes, while simultaneously profiting from their labor and exploiting their bodies. The argument began with Augustine of Hippo, the 4th century bishop, whose influence on Christian thought extended across a millennium. Augustine's writings on sexuality were complex, marked by his own struggles with desire before his conversion. He regarded sexual pleasure with deep suspicion, viewing it as a consequence of the fall, a disordered appetite that drew men away from God. Yet he also understood that society could not function if every sexual transgression led to violent disorder. In his treatise De Ordine, written around 386, Augustine made a claim that would echo through centuries of legal and theological debate. He argued that removing prostitutes from Christian society would disrupt public life through unchecked lust. The metaphor he employed was blunt. Remove prostitution, he suggested, and you fill the world with uncontrolled sexual chaos. The implication was clear. Prostitutes served a social function by absorbing male desire that might otherwise be directed toward respectable women, toward other men, or into acts of violence. Augustine did not celebrate prostitution. He considered the women who engaged in it to be sinners, their souls imperiled, their bodies morally polluted, but he regarded their presence as a necessary accommodation to human weakness. The alternative, in his view, was worse. Men deprived of licit outlets for sexual urges would resort to rape, adultery, or sodomy. Prostitutes, therefore, occupied a sacrificial position in the moral economy of Christian society. They absorbed sin so that others might remain pure. This was not protection. It was instrumentalization dressed in the language of social necessity. The doctrine lay dormant for centuries, embedded in theological texts, but not yet formalized into civic policy. The transformation came in the High Middle Ages, when urbanization, commerce, and population growth created the conditions for widespread commercial sex work. Theologians revisited Augustine's argument and found it useful. Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican friar, whose synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology dominated 13th century intellectual life, restated the doctrine in his Summa Theologica, completed in the 1270s. Aquinas accepted Augustine's premise, but refined it with scholastic precision. He compared prostitution to a sewer in a palace. Remove the sewer, he wrote, and the entire structure becomes foul. The metaphor was deliberately coarse. Prostitutes were waste channels, morally polluted but functionally necessary. They carried away the corruption that would otherwise contaminate the body politic. Aquinas went further. He argued that princely tolerance of prostitution was not only permissible but prudent. Human law, he maintained, should not attempt to prohibit every vice. To do so would risk greater harm, including rebellion and disorder. Instead, rulers should tolerate certain lesser evils in order to preserve the common good. Prostitution fell into this category. It was sinful, but its suppression would destabilize society. Aquinas did not suggest that prostitutes themselves should be honored or protected. Their work remained shameful, but the existence of the trade and the civic structures that contained it served a higher purpose. The logic was circular and self-justifying. Society needed prostitutes because men demanded sexual access. Men demanded sexual access because society provided prostitutes. The women themselves were never consulted. The institutional church reinforced this compromise through canon law and conciliar decree. The Fourth Lateran Council, convened by Pope Innocent III in 1215, addressed sexual morality with unprecedented rigor. The council mandated annual confession, defined marriage as a sacrament requiring public vows, and condemned clerical concubinage. It sought to impose order on a Christendom fractured by heresy, political conflict, and moral laxity. Yet even as it tightened standards for legitimate sexuality, the council said little about prostitution itself. The omission was telling. Canon law condemned fornication, classified it as sin, and prescribed penance for those who engaged in it. But it did not call for the eradication of prostitutes. The distinction between moral condemnation and practical toleration was maintained. Prostitutes could be fined, marked, restricted, and humiliated, but they could not be eliminated. This ambivalence created space for civic authorities to regulate the trade without fear of ecclesiastical censure. By the 13th century, municipal governments across southern France, Italy, and the Low Countries were establishing licensed brothels, zoning districts for prostitution, and collecting taxes on sexual commerce. The theological framework provided by Augustine and Aquinas gave these policies ideological cover. City councils could argue that they were not endorsing sin but managing it, channeling disorder into controlled spaces where it could be monitored and contained. Preachers might denounce fornication from the pulpit, but the same cities that funded those pulpits also leased buildings to brothel keepers and employed guards to police the boundaries of red light districts. The contradiction was baked into the system. The doctrine also shaped legal treatment of prostitutes themselves. Canon law required that women who sold sex be offered paths to repentance, but it did not mandate their acceptance back into respectable society. A prostitute who wished to leave the trade and marry faced ecclesiastical scrutiny. Some church courts debated whether such marriages were valid, whether a woman stained by public sexual commerce could become a legitimate wife. The general consensus was cautious approval, provided the woman had undergone penance and the marriage was public. But social practice was harsher than theological theory. Former prostitutes were rarely welcomed into guilds, confraternities, or respectable households. The mark of their former trade followed them. The church taught that repentance was always possible, that no sinner was beyond redemption, but it also taught that certain sins left permanent stains. Prostitution was one of them. The economic dimension of this doctrine cannot be separated from its moral claims. By framing prostitution as necessary, the church and civic authorities created a system in which women's bodies became instruments of social policy. The language of necessity obscured the fact that the trade was driven not by abstract male lust, but by poverty, coercion, and the absence of economic alternatives for women. Theologians spoke of preserving order and preventing rape. They did not speak of the structural forces that left women with no choice but to sell sex in order to eat. The doctrine of necessary evil erased agency and replaced it with function. Prostitutes were not people making constrained decisions in brutal circumstances. They were social infrastructure, as impersonal as city walls or drainage ditches. This framework also legitimized violence and exploitation. If prostitutes existed to absorb male vice, then their suffering was part of their utility. Assault, theft, and murder of prostitutes carried lighter penalties than the same crimes against respectable women. The logic was implicit, but pervasive. A woman who sold her body had already degraded herself. Further degradation was simply the cost of her role. Legal records from across medieval Europe reflect this. Cases of violence against prostitutes were prosecuted inconsistently, often dropped or resolved with minimal punishment for the perpetrators. The theological doctrine that justified the trade also devalued the lives of those who worked within it. Yet the doctrine was never universally accepted, even within the church. Monastic reformers, mendicant preachers, and rigorous theologians pushed back against the Augustinian compromise. They argued that tolerating vice was itself a form of participation in sin, that cities which licensed brothels were complicit in fornication. These voices grew louder in the 14th and 15th centuries, fueled by plague, war, and apocalyptic anxiety, but they did not prevail. The practical needs of urban governance and the economic interests embedded in regulated prostitution proved stronger than moral objections. The doctrine of necessary evil held because it served too many purposes at once. It allowed cities to profit from the trade, men to access sexual commerce without legal consequence, and the church to maintain moral authority while avoiding the chaos that suppression might provoke. This theological compromise did not exist in a vacuum. It emerged from and shaped the economic and social realities of medieval towns, where poverty, patriarchy, and urban growth created the conditions for widespread commercial sex. The doctrine carved out space for tolerance, but doctrine alone did not fill brothels. Women entered the trade, not because theologians debated the limits of sin, but because hunger, displacement, and the collapse of family structure left them nowhere else to turn. The pathways into prostitution were numerous and cruel, shaped by forces far beyond individual control: famine that emptied countryside villages, wars that destroyed livelihoods, plagues that killed husbands and fathers, and an economic order that offered women almost no means of survival outside marriage or the narrowest forms of labor. To understand how prostitution became woven into the fabric of medieval urban life, one must first understand the machinery of poverty that produced its workforce. Famine arrived in waves across medieval Europe, and each wave carried women into cities. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed millions and drove survivors from rural estates into towns where food supplies, though scarce, were at least rumored to exist. A young woman whose parents had died, whose siblings had scattered, whose lord's manor could no longer feed its tenants, faced a stark arithmetic. She could beg, she could steal, she could sell, the only asset she possessed that required no tools, no guild membership, no capital, her body. The same calculus applied during the 100 Years' War when armies burned fields and requisitioned grain, leaving whole regions destitute. Women widowed by war, women whose husbands had been conscripted or killed, women whose homes had been torched by passing soldiers, arrived in cities like Paris, Rouen, and Bruges with nothing. Some found work as laundresses or servants, many did not. The Black Death in 1348 changed the equation again, but not in the way one might expect. The plague killed between a third and half of Europe's population, and in its immediate aftermath, labor shortages drove wages up and loosened some social restrictions. Yet the plague also orphaned children, widowed women in enormous numbers, and shattered kinship networks that had provided safety. A widow with property might remarry or live on rents. A widow without property, especially one past childbearing age or without family to vouch for her, became a problem for urban authorities and a candidate for the poorest forms of labor. Subsequent outbreaks of plague throughout the 14th and 15th centuries ensured that this population of displaced, unsupported women remained large. Cities grew during this period, and their growth required workers, but the demand was for male artisans, laborers, and apprentices protected by guilds. Women had no guilds. Widowhood without resources was one of the most common pathways into prostitution. A woman married to a cobbler or a day laborer might survive his death if she had a son old enough to work, or if his guild provided a pension, or if a family took her in. Most had none of these. The medieval economy offered women few options. Textile piecework paid poorly and required tools and raw materials. Domestic service demanded a reference and was competitive. Selling food or ale required startup capital and, often, a license. A widow alone, with mouths to feed, debts accumulating, and landlords demanding rent, faced a choice that was not really a choice. She could sell sex irregularly to survive until something better appeared, or she could enter a brothel where at least lodging and a measure of protection might be guaranteed, however exploitative the terms. Familial coercion pushed others into the trade with even less pretense of choice. Fathers sold daughters to brothel keepers to settle debts. Brothers handed over sisters when a family faced ruin or when a dowry could not be assembled and marriage was impossible. The legal and social mechanisms varied by region, but the pattern was consistent. A girl or young woman became a form of currency. Her body traded to discharge an obligation or generate income. In some cases, this exchange was formalized through contracts that bound the woman to a brothel keeper for a set term, during which her earnings would go toward repaying the debt. In practice, these terms were rarely honored. Fees for food, lodging, clothing, and fines for infractions accumulated faster than earnings, trapping women in a cycle of bondage that could last years or a lifetime. The language of debt made the arrangement appear voluntary, even commercial, but the reality was servitude enforced by violence and the threat of legal punishment for breach of contract. Urban migration created another vulnerable population. Young women left rural villages for cities hoping to find work as servants, wet nurses, or seamstresses. They arrived without connections, without letters of reference, without knowledge of urban geography or social networks. They were prey. Procuresses and pimps stationed themselves near city gates, at inns, at hiring fairs, watching for new arrivals who looked lost. A woman promised domestic work might find herself delivered instead to a brothel. A woman who found legitimate work but lost it due to pregnancy, illness, or an employer's whim might have no way to pay for lodging and no means to return home. Cities were places of opportunity, but they were also machines that sorted people by utility. and women without male protection or guild affiliation were sorted quickly toward the bottom. The economic alternatives available to unmarried or widowed women were few and harsh. Marriage required a dowry, and dowries required family wealth or years of saved wages. Domestic service meant long hours, low pay, vulnerability to sexual exploitation by employers, and no security. Textile work, the most common form of female wage labor, involved spinning, weaving, or sewing for piece rates that barely covered food. A woman could work herself to exhaustion and still fall short of rent. Selling sex, by contrast, could generate enough income in a night to cover several days' expenses. The trade was dangerous and degrading, but it was also more lucrative than the alternatives, and for women facing starvation or homelessness, the calculation was simple. Moralists condemned prostitution as sin. The women who practiced it often saw it as survival. Some women entered the trade gradually, without a clear moment of decision. A servant who slept with her employer in exchange for not being dismissed. A laundress who accepted money from a client after washing his linens. A tavern worker who realized that men would pay for more than ale. Each transaction blurred the line between labor and prostitution until the line ceased to matter. Other women were sold outright, their entry into the trade a single violent rupture. Still others chose prostitution deliberately, weighing their options and concluding that brothel work, however grim, offered more autonomy than marriage to a man they did not know, or more stability than begging. The diversity of pathways reflects the diversity of women's circumstances, but all pathways shared a common feature. They were shaped by structures of economic exclusion, legal marginalization, and patriarchal control that left women with almost no room to maneuver. The role of plague, famine, and war in driving women into prostitution cannot be overstated. These were not merely background conditions, they were engines of displacement that produced waves of vulnerable people whom cities then processed according to their usefulness. Men could join militias, guilds, or labor gangs. Women could marry, serve, or sell sex. The narrowness of these options was not accidental. It was the product of legal codes that restricted women's property rights, guild regulations that excluded them from skilled trades, and religious teachings that defined their value primarily through chastity or motherhood. When those frameworks failed, as they did for thousands of women across medieval Europe, prostitution became one of the few remaining means of survival. Once in the trade, women entered a world governed not by choice, but by structures of control, exploitation, and surveillance imposed by pimps, brothel keepers, and civic authorities alike. Women's bodies were problems to be solved, and by the 13th century, civic authorities across southern France and northern Italy had concluded that the solution was containment. The question was not whether prostitution would exist, but where it would happen, under whose supervision, and how much revenue it might generate for municipal coffers. What emerged was not charity or protection, but a system of licensed exploitation dressed in the language of public order. The brothel became a civic institution, as ordinary in its way as the marketplace or the gibbet. The first municipal brothels appeared in southern France during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, concentrated in cities like Avignon, Toulouse, Montpellier, and Arles. These were not spontaneous developments. Urban populations had surged, swollen by rural migrants, discharged soldiers, itinerant laborers, and pilgrims moving along trade routes and shrine paths. With growth came disorder, brawls in taverns, assaults in alleyways, complaints from guild members and churchmen about women soliciting near respectable establishments. Civic councils faced pressure to impose control, and they turned to a model that had ancient precedent and theological cover. If prostitution could not be eliminated, it could at least be corralled, taxed, and rendered legible to authority. Avignon provides an early example. By the mid-1300s, the city operated a licensed brothel under civic oversight, leased to a private operator who paid an annual fee to the municipal treasury. The operator, typically a man of modest means seeking steady income, managed the premises, collected payments from the women who worked there, and ensured compliance with civic regulations. The women themselves paid rent for their rooms, handed over a portion of their earnings, and lived under rules that dictated when they could leave the building, where they could walk, and what they could wear. The system was efficient in its way. It concentrated vice in a single location, made enforcement straightforward, and turned moral pollution into a reliable source of revenue. Toulouse followed a similar pattern. The city's Grand Bordel was established by civic ordinance in 1372, though informal regulation likely preceded the formal charter. The brothel occupied a street near the city walls, away from churches and guild halls but close enough to the commercial district to attract clients. The lease was auctioned periodically, and the winning bidder gained the right to operate the establishment for a fixed term, usually 1 to 3 years. In return, he paid a substantial sum up front and agreed to abide by a thick sheaf of regulations. He could not employ married women, he could not harbour thieves or known criminals, he could not permit violence on the premises, though enforcement of that rule was another matter. He was required to keep the building in repair, maintain adequate lighting, and report any outbreaks of disease to the municipal health officers. The women who worked in these brothels were not employees in any modern sense. They were tenants, debtors, and captives of a system that offered the illusion of legal protection while extracting maximum profit. A woman entering a municipal brothel typically owed money immediately for her room, for her meals, for clothing, if she arrived with none, for the brothel keeper's cut of her earnings. These debts accumulated faster than they could be repaid. A client might pay 6 deniers for a visit. The woman kept 2. The brothel keeper took 3, and 1 went toward her room and board. If she fell ill, the debt grew. If she refused a client, she was fined. If she left without the keeper's permission, civic guards were authorized to retrieve her and impose additional penalties. The regulations extended far beyond the brothel walls. In Dijon, ordinances from the 1420s specified that prostitutes could not live outside the designated brothel district, could not solicit near churches or convents, and were forbidden from walking the streets during religious festivals or processions. Curfews were common. In many cities, women were required to return to the brothel by sunset or face fines and public punishment. Some cities designated particular streets or alleys where solicitation was permitted. Stepping beyond those boundaries invited arrest. Venice developed one of the most elaborate systems, overseen by the Signori di Notte, a magistracy responsible for policing nocturnal disorder. The Signori maintained registers of licensed prostitutes, inspected brothels, and enforced zoning laws that restricted where women could live and work. The Rialto district became a recognized zone for higher status courtesans, while cheaper establishments clustered near the docks and markets. Licensing itself was a mechanism of control and revenue. In some cities, women paid annual fees for the right to work legally. In others, the brothel keeper paid a lump sum that covered all women under his roof, effectively binding them to his establishment for the term of the lease. Fines were routine and lucrative. A woman caught working outside the licensed zone might forfeit a week's earnings. A brothel keeper who harbored unlicensed women faced steeper penalties. Though enforcement was inconsistent and often negotiable, civic officials had little incentive to eliminate prostitution. They had every incentive to regulate it in ways that filled municipal treasuries and maintained the appearance of order. The architecture of these establishments reflected their dual function as spaces of commerce and containment. Most were multi-story timber or stone buildings, arranged around a central courtyard or common room. The ground floor typically housed a tavern or reception area where clients negotiated terms and paid fees. Upper floors contained small rooms, barely large enough for a bed and a chest. Windows were small, often barred, and faced inward toward the courtyard rather than the street. This design served practical purposes. It prevented escape, limited visibility from outside, and concentrated activity in ways that made supervision easier. Some brothels employed guards or doorkeepers, men tasked with managing clients, collecting payments, and ensuring that women did not leave without permission. Violence was common, both from clients and from the keepers themselves, and the legal recourse available to the women was non-existent. A prostitute could not testify against a respectable man in most jurisdictions, and complaints against a brothel keeper were rarely entertained by civic courts. The revenue generated by this system was substantial enough to matter in municipal budgets. Toulouse's Grand Bordel lease brought in several hundred livres annually, a sum comparable to taxes on grain or wine. Fines added more. In Dijon, records from the 1440s show that penalties levied on unlicensed prostitutes and their clients contributed meaningfully to civic income, particularly during periods when other revenues declined. The system created perverse incentives. Officials benefited from maintaining a steady population of women in the trade, which meant tolerating the coercion and debt bondage that kept them there. The rhetoric of public order masked a simpler truth. Prostitution was profitable for those who controlled it, and regulation served the interests of municipal authorities and brothel keepers far more than it served the women whose labor sustained the enterprise. Yet civic authorities framed the system in moral and protective language. Ordinances described the brothels as necessary safeguards against rape and disorder, places that channeled male lust away from respectable women and prevented the greater sin of adultery. The women were portrayed as willing participants, choosing a shameful but legally tolerated livelihood. The reality was debt, coercion, and the absence of alternatives. A woman who entered a municipal brothel rarely left on her own terms. She might age out, fall too ill to work, or die there. Escape required money she did not have, connections she could not access, and a willingness to risk brutal punishment if caught. The system was designed to trap, and it succeeded. Regulation required visibility, and visibility required marking. Medieval cities used clothing, color, and public ritual to identify and control the women who sold sex. In 1398, the Town Council of Avignon passed an ordinance requiring all public women to wear a striped hood of red and white cloth, visible at 50 paces, under penalty of flogging and expulsion. The law was not unique. Across the cities of late medieval Europe, civic authorities mandated that women who sold sex mark themselves through clothing, color, and fabric, transforming the body into a legible text of moral status. These regulations did more than identify. They isolated, humiliated, and justified violence. A woman wearing the yellow hood of a prostitute in Toulouse or the bells sewn onto her cloak in Montpellier became a public target, her occupation announced to every passer-by. The sumptuary laws that governed prostitution were instruments of control as precise as any brothel wall, enforcing visibility where anonymity might have offered protection. The choice of color was deliberate. Yellow, in particular, carried associations with deceit, heresy, and pollution across Christian Europe. It was the color Jews were forced to wear on badges in many regions after the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, linking religious and sexual otherness in the visual language of exclusion. In Toulouse, prostitutes wore a white band on the shoulder. In Vienna, a yellow scarf. In Marseille, a striped cloak. The specific garment varied by city, but the principle remained constant. The clothing must be distinctive, unmistakable, and humiliating. Stripes, in medieval iconography, signified transgression and marginality. They appeared on the clothing of executioners, lepers, and jesters, marking those who existed outside the normative social order. When applied to prostitutes, stripes reinforced the idea that these women were Wujan sources of moral contagion, necessary perhaps, but never acceptable. Bells served a similar function. In several French towns, ordinances required prostitutes to attach small bells to their clothing, producing a sound that announced their approach. The practice echoed the bells lepers were forced to carry, creating an auditory boundary around bodies deemed dangerous. The jingling marked the woman as she walked through market squares or narrow streets, ensuring that respectable citizens could avoid contact. It also made her vulnerable. A woman whose presence was announced by sound could not move through a city unnoticed, could not escape an assailant, could not blend into a crowd when violence threatened. The bell was both identifier and trap, a sonic tether that bound her to public surveillance. Enforcement of these dress codes was inconsistent but periodic and brutal. Court records from Dijon in 1443 describe the case of a woman named Jehanne, accused of working outside the city's official brothel and failing to wear the required yellow hood. She was paraded through the streets, her hair shorn, her face painted with flour and soot, before being expelled from the city gates. The public humiliation served multiple purposes. It punished the individual, reinforced the authority of civic officials, and reminded other women of the consequences of defiance. These rituals of shaming, known in French as charivaris or in English as rough music, mobilized community participation in the enforcement of sexual norms. Neighbors, guild members, and even children joined in jeering, throwing refuse, and marking the woman's passage through hostile space. The symbolic violence of marked clothing extended beyond the garments themselves. It shaped how violence against prostitutes was understood and adjudicated. In many cities, a man who assaulted a woman wearing the mandated hood or cloak faced lighter penalties than if he had attacked a woman of respectable status. The logic was circular and vicious. Because the woman had marked herself as sexually available and morally compromised, she had forfeited the protections afforded to other women. Her clothing became evidence against her, a visible sign that she had invited whatever harm befell her. This legal reasoning appeared in court records from Paris, Lyon, and Florence, where judges dismissed complaints from prostitutes on the grounds that their occupation made them unworthy of judicial protection. The dress code, ostensibly a regulatory tool, became a license for predation. Yet the laws were also sites of tension and occasional resistance. Some women refused to wear the mandated markers, risking fines, imprisonment, or expulsion. Others found ways to subvert the regulations through subtle alterations. In Venice, where prostitutes were required to wear yellow veils, some women commissioned veils of such fine silk and elaborate embroidery that the garment became a statement of defiance rather than shame. Wealth, when available, offered a narrow avenue for challenging the visual language of degradation. Courtesans in Italian cities, who occupied a slightly higher social position than street workers, sometimes dressed in fashions that mimicked those of respectable women, blurring the boundaries that sumptuary laws sought to enforce. Civic authorities responded with escalating specificity, issuing ordinances that regulated not only color but also fabric quality, sleeve length, and jewelry, in an endless attempt to fix visual categories that refused to stay fixed. The symbolic function of these laws extended into the realm of urban space. By marking prostitutes as visually distinct, cities created a mobile geography of exclusion. A woman in a yellow hood walking through a market square carried her marginalization with her, transforming any space she entered into a site of moral pollution. This was particularly important in cities where prostitutes were not confined to specific districts. The dress code allowed authorities to regulate movement without the expense and complexity of maintaining physical boundaries. It turned the woman herself into a boundary, a walking perimeter that respectable citizens were expected to avoid. The effect was to make the city legible, to impose order on the chaos of urban life, by ensuring that sexual commerce remained visible and contained, even when it occurred outside designated zones. In England, the situation was somewhat different but no less coercive. The Southwark stews, operating under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, imposed their own dress codes, though the specifics varied over time. Women working in the stews were forbidden from wearing the hoods and veils of respectable married women, and some ordinances required them to wear striped hoods or distinctive aprons. The regulations were enforced by the bailiffs who managed the brothels, and violations could result in expulsion from the stews, which often meant loss of livelihood and descent into street prostitution, where conditions were far more dangerous and legal protections even more scarce. The connection between marked clothing and social hierarchy was explicit in the language of the ordinances themselves. A statute from Avignon in 1441 stated that prostitutes must wear their designated clothing so that honest women would not be mistaken for them, and so that the moral order of the city would be preserved. The fear was not only of sexual disorder, but of categorical confusion. If prostitutes could dress like respectable women, the visual markers that upheld social hierarchy would collapse. The entire system of medieval urban life depended on the legibility of status, and the dress codes for prostitutes were part of a broader regime of sumptuary legislation that regulated what fabrics, colors, and styles different classes and occupations could wear. Prostitutes sat at the bottom of this hierarchy, their clothing a constant reminder of their exclusion from the protections and privileges afforded to others. The psychological weight of these regulations is harder to measure but no less real. To be forced to wear clothing that announced one's degradation every time one left a room, to know that the garment itself invited assault and mockery, to have no choice but to carry the sign of one's occupation in plain view, was a form of daily humiliation that compounded the dangers and indignities of the trade itself. Some women internalized the shame, others grew numb to it, and still others, in rare documented moments, spoke back against it. A court record from Toulouse in 1459 preserves the testimony of a woman who protested that the hood she was forced to wear made her a target for violence and that she could not safely walk the streets after dark. The court dismissed her complaint. The visibility was the point. Visibility did not guarantee safety. In fact, it often invited violence, and the daily life of a medieval prostitute was shaped by physical danger, disease, and the absence of legal protection. A woman who sold sex in a medieval city carried her vulnerability like a second skin. The marks on her clothing announced her status, but they also announced something else: that she could be struck, robbed, or assaulted with little consequence to the attacker. The systems that made prostitution visible and regulated also stripped away the protections that other women, however limited, might claim. To be publicly identified as a prostitute was to exist outside the ordinary bounds of legal personhood. It was to live in a state where harm done to your body carried almost no weight in the eyes of law, church, or community. Violence against prostitutes was not an occasional hazard. It was woven into the fabric of the trade itself. Clients who paid for access believed, often correctly, that they could inflict injury without repercussion. A woman beaten in a brothel chamber or a back alley had few avenues for complaint. Civic courts, staffed by male magistrates and operating within frameworks of Christian morality, viewed prostitutes as morally compromised witnesses whose testimony carried little credibility. Canon law treated fornication as sin, and secular law treated prostitutes as necessary pollutants. Neither system was designed to protect them. When a prostitute appeared before a judge to accuse a man of assault or theft, her occupation itself became evidence against her. She was presumed to have invited the harm, to have forfeited her right to bodily integrity the moment she accepted coin for sex. The records that survive from municipal courts across France, Italy, and England reveal a pattern. Complaints brought by prostitutes were dismissed, reduced, or turned against the women themselves. In Dijon in 1462, a woman named Margot testified that a group of men had dragged her from a tavern and beaten her in the street, taking the coins she had earned that night. The court fined her for soliciting outside the authorized brothel. In Venice, the Signori di Notte kept records of assaults reported by women working near the Rialto, but prosecution was rare unless the victim was a respectable woman mistaken for a prostitute. The assumption embedded in the law was clear. A woman who sold sex had already placed herself beyond the protections afforded to others. Her body was public property in a way that other women's bodies, at least in theory, were not. Rape was endemic, and the legal concept of rape itself excluded prostitutes in many jurisdictions. If a woman could not be considered chaste, she could not be considered rapeable under the logic of medieval jurisprudence. This was not merely a theoretical cruelty. It had practical, daily consequences. Men who raped prostitutes did so with near impunity, knowing that even if the woman survived to report the crime, her word would be weighed against her occupation and found wanting. The few cases that reached trial often ended in acquittal or token fines. In some cities, gang rape of prostitutes by young men of the artisan or merchant classes was treated as a youthful indiscretion rather than a serious crime. The violence was understood, in the cold language of law, as theft of services rather than violation of person. The people who perpetrated this violence were not strangers lurking in shadows. They were clients, yes, but also civic officials who extorted sex in exchange for overlooking violations of dress codes or curfew. They were brothel keepers who beat women for withholding earnings or attempting to leave. They were neighbors who saw a marked woman walking alone and understood that she could be shoved, spat upon, or struck without social cost. The yellow hood or striped cloak that the law required became an invitation. It told every passerby that this body was already condemned, already outside the circle of persons to whom ordinary moral prohibitions against harm applied. Disease was another constant companion. Though medieval medicine lacked both the vocabulary and the tools to understand or treat sexually transmitted infections, women in the trade suffered from what later centuries would identify as syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, these were understood vaguely as corruptions of the blood or humoral imbalances. Pain, discharge, sores, and fevers were common. There were no effective treatments. Physicians, when they treated prostitutes at all, prescribed bloodletting, herbal poultices, or prayers to saints associated with healing. The infections often became chronic, leading to infertility, disfigurement, or death. Syphilis, which arrived in epidemic form in the 1490s, would later be blamed on prostitutes, but the disease had already existed in less virulent forms for decades, spreading silently through populations with no understanding of contagion. Pregnancy was both frequent and dangerous. Contraception was rudimentary and unreliable. Herbal pessaries, withdrawal or timing methods based on flawed understandings of fertility. Many women became pregnant repeatedly. Childbirth in medieval Europe was hazardous even for women with access to midwives, clean water, and rest. For prostitutes, often malnourished and working until late in pregnancy, the risks multiplied. Stillbirth and maternal death were common. Infants born to prostitutes faced grim prospects. Some were abandoned at church doorsteps or left in foundling hospitals, which existed in larger cities but had high mortality rates. Others were smothered shortly after birth, a crime that appears repeatedly in court records but was difficult to prove and often treated leniently when the accused was a desperate woman rather than a respectable mother. Infanticide was one of the grimmest realities of the trade, though it must be understood within its context. A prostitute who gave birth had few options. Raising a child required resources she did not have: stable housing, time away from work, and social acceptance that would never be granted. Brothel keepers often forbade women from keeping infants, viewing them as impediments to profit. Clients did not want to encounter crying babies. The law offered no support for unwed mothers, particularly those whose occupation marked them as morally unfit. In some cases, women attempted to place children with rural wet nurses or relatives, but this required money and connections that many lacked. The silence in the records around infant deaths is telling. These were not deaths that cities investigated with vigor. They were expected, in the cold arithmetic of a society that condemned the women who bore them. The psychological toll of this existence is harder to document, but no less real. To live under constant threat of violence, to endure chronic illness without treatment, to face pregnancy as a recurring crisis, and to do so while marked publicly as morally polluted. This was a life of compounded trauma. The sources rarely allow us to hear the voices of the women themselves, but the fragments we have suggest exhaustion, resignation, and moments of bitter defiance. A woman hauled before the Echevins of Toulouse in 1473 for cursing at a city guard gave testimony recorded in court records. She said she was tired of being spat on by men who used her body and then called her whore in the daylight. She said she would rather be hanged than continue. The court fined her for disorderly conduct and sent her back to the brothel. Social ostracism compounded the physical dangers. Prostitutes were barred from most churches, denied communion, and buried in unhallowed ground. They could not join guilds, own property in their own names, or claim inheritance. Neighbors avoided them, and children threw stones. The marking of their clothing ensured they could never blend in, never escape the label, never move through the city without being identified and reminded of their status. This was isolation enforced through ritual and law, a daily grinding reminder that they existed outside the bounds of Christian community and human fellowship. Yet survival required endurance. Women found ways to navigate the dangers, to form alliances, to resist when possible. Some carried knives for protection. Others formed bonds with other women in the trade, sharing information about dangerous clients or offering shelter when one among them was injured. These acts of mutual aid appear in court records as secondary details. Two women sharing a room, one testifying that her companion had been attacked, another helping a friend escape a violent pimp. These were not grand gestures of rebellion. They were the small, necessary accommodations of people living under siege, trying to stay alive in a world structured to consume them. Behind many of these women stood figures who controlled their labor and earnings, pimps, procuresses, and brothel keepers who operated as both protectors and exploiters. Behind nearly every woman who sold sex in medieval Europe stood someone who claimed a share of what she earned. The trade was never simply a transaction between woman and client. It was mediated, controlled, and profited from by a network of intermediaries whose power rested on exploitation dressed as protection. Male pimps, female procuresses, and brothel keepers formed the infrastructure of medieval prostitution, their authority maintained through debt, violence, and the legal ambiguity of their status. They were parasites and gatekeepers both, extracting labor while offering just enough shelter to keep women bound. Male pimps operated in the shadows and on street corners, recruiting women through a mixture of seduction, false promises, and outright coercion. Young women arriving in cities from rural famine zones, widows expelled from guild-protected trades, girls abandoned by families who could not feed them, all were vulnerable to men who offered food, lodging, or the illusion of affection in exchange for their labor. Once a woman accepted that first meal or shared a bed in a rented room, the debt began. A pimp might claim she owed him for protection, for introducing her to clients, for the room she slept in, for the clothes she wore to attract trade. The arithmetic was always rigged. No matter how many men she serviced, the debt grew faster than her earnings could cover it. Pimps extracted their share through direct intimidation or by positioning themselves as essential intermediaries. In cities where street prostitution flourished outside regulated zones, pimps acted as enforcers and negotiators, collecting money from women each night and beating those who withheld coin or attempted to work independently. They identified clients, arranged encounters, and protected women from particularly violent customers, though that protection was selective, offered only when it served their financial interest. A pimp might defend a woman from a client who refused to pay, but he would just as readily assault her himself if she failed to meet his demands. The relationship was never reciprocal. It was extraction dressed as partnership. Female procuresses and madams occupied a more institutionalized position within the trade, managing brothels and boarding houses where multiple women lived and worked under one roof. These women were often older, former prostitutes themselves who had accumulated enough capital or favor to lease a building and recruit younger workers. Some operated with civic licenses, paying fees to municipal authorities and adhering to regulations about curfews, health inspections, and the conduct of business. Others ran unlicensed establishments, constantly at risk of fines, closure, or prosecution. In either case, their control over the women in their charge was absolute. A madam determined which clients a woman would service, what prices she would charge, and how much of her earnings she could keep. In regulated brothels such as those in Dijon or Toulouse, lease agreements between civic officials and brothel keepers specified the terms under which women could be housed. But these contracts said nothing about the treatment of the women themselves. A madam might provide food, clothing, and a bed, but she also set the terms of debt repayment. If a woman arrived at the brothel with nothing, the madam provided her with shoes, a cloak, perhaps a comb or a camise. Each item was recorded as a debt. If the woman became ill and could not work, the cost of her care was added to the ledger. If she became pregnant and required the services of a midwife or an abortifacient, those expenses compounded her obligation. Debt bondage was the most effective mechanism of control in the medieval sex trade. Women could not leave a brothel or a pimp's protection until their debts were cleared, and the debts were designed never to clear. Interest accumulated, fines for minor infractions, speaking disrespectfully, refusing a client, arriving late to the common room, were deducted from already meager earnings. Food and lodging were overpriced. A woman might work for months or years and find herself deeper in obligation than when she began. The system mirrored the debt peonage that trapped rural laborers to landowners, but it operated with even less legal oversight. A peasant might appeal to a lord or a manorial court. A prostitute had no such recourse. Procuresses recruited aggressively, particularly in the wake of plague outbreaks or famines, when urban populations swelled with desperate migrants. Court records from 14th century Avignon describe women accused of luring young girls into brothels with promises of domestic work, only to force them into sexual service once they were inside. A procuress might identify a girl selling bread in a market square, strike up a conversation, offer her a warm meal, and suggest she come to a house where there was work and safety. Once inside, the girl would be told she owed money for the meal, for the bed she slept in, for the time the procuress had spent finding her. If she resisted, she might be locked in a room, beaten, or threatened with exposure to civic authorities who would punish her for fornication, whether she had chosen the act or not. The legal status of pimps and brothel keepers varied dramatically across regions and over time. In southern French cities where municipal brothels operated under civic license, brothel keepers were quasi-legitimate figures, paying annual fees and subject to inspection by town officials. They were listed in tax rolls, attended civic functions, and sometimes held minor positions within urban guilds. Yet even these licensed operators faced prosecution if they overstepped boundaries. A brothel keeper in Toulouse might be fined for housing women who had not registered with civic authorities, for allowing minors into the establishment, or for permitting clients to stay past curfew. The fines were regular enough to suggest that enforcement was as much about revenue extraction as moral regulation. In cities without formal regulation, pimps and procuresses operated in a legal grey zone, tolerated as long as they remained discreet and paid informal bribes to constables or night watchmen. If violence became too visible, if neighbours complained, or if a woman died under suspicious circumstances, civic officials would crack down. A pimp might be flogged, expelled from the city, or imprisoned for a few weeks before resuming his trade elsewhere. Female procuresses faced similar punishment, though their prosecutions often carried an additional layer of moral condemnation. A woman who profited from the sexual labor of other women was seen as doubly transgressive, violating both the legal order and the expected role of women as guardians of virtue. Violence was both a tool and a constant threat within this system. Pimps beat women who withheld earnings, who tried to leave, or who spoke to civic authorities. Madams used isolation, food deprivation, and public humiliation to enforce compliance. Women who resisted might be locked in cellars, denied clients and therefore income, or sold to another brothel in a different city where they knew no one and had no hope of escape. The threat of violence was often enough. A woman who had seen another beaten for defiance understood the cost of resistance. The structure relied on spectacle and memory, on the knowledge that rebellion would be met with pain. Economic dependency reinforced these dynamics. A woman who had spent months or years working for a pimp or madam had no savings, no guild affiliation, no kinship network that would take her in. If she fled, she faced arrest as a vagrant or as an unregistered prostitute working outside sanctioned zones. If she sought refuge in a church or a Magdalene house, she would be required to confess, perform penance, and submit to a regime of labor and prayer that offered no real autonomy. The choice was not between freedom and captivity, but between forms of captivity that differed only in degree. Some pimps and madams cultivated reputations as protectors, emphasizing the dangers women faced on their own and positioning themselves as necessary guardians. They were not entirely wrong. A woman working alone was more vulnerable to assault, theft, and arrest. A pimp could intervene when a client turned violent, though his intervention was motivated by preserving a source of income rather than concern for the woman herself. A madam might provide a degree of safety within the walls of a brothel, enforcing rules against weapons and extreme violence, but that safety came at the price of autonomy and a lifetime of debt. The economics of exploitation was straightforward. A pimp or brothel keeper invested little, perhaps the cost of a meal, a room, or a second-hand cloak, and extracted ongoing labor. The initial outlay was repaid many times over, and as long as the woman remained in debt, her labor continued to generate profit. If she became too ill, too old, or too visibly damaged to attract clients, she could be expelled or replaced. The supply of desperate women was inexhaustible. Famine, war, plague, and the structural exclusion of women from most urban trades ensured a steady stream of recruits. Not all women remained trapped. Some sought escape through religious refuge, marriage, or moral reform, though these paths were narrow and fraught with their own hardships. Leaving the trade was possible, but only just. The exit was narrow, guarded by religious authorities, civic officials, and a society that remembered shame far longer than it acknowledged suffering. A woman who wished to step away from prostitution in the 14th or 15th century faced not freedom, but a different kind of enclosure, one built from penance, labor, and the permanent mark of her past. The paths out were few, and each carried its own burden. The most visible option was the Magdalene house, named for Mary Magdalene, the repentant sinner of gospel tradition. These institutions began appearing across Europe in the 13th century, accelerating in the 14th. They were convents of a particular kind, designed not for virgins but for women deemed fallen and redeemable. Cities such as Paris, Marseille, Rome, and Vienna established houses under the administration of religious orders, often the Dominicans or Franciscans, with support from civic authorities and wealthy patrons. The rhetoric was one of mercy and salvation. The reality was something closer to supervised reform through unending work. Entry into a Magdalene house required proof of intent. A woman could not simply arrive at the door. In many cities, she needed a sponsor, often a priest or a representative of a charitable confraternity, who would vouch for her genuine desire to abandon her former life. Some houses required a public declaration before civic or ecclesiastical officials, a formal renunciation of prostitution that became part of the municipal record. This was not merely symbolic, it marked her legally as reformed, and any return to the trade could result in harsher penalties, including permanent expulsion from the city or branding. Once inside, the structure was monastic, but without the dignity afforded to professed nuns. The women were called penitents, not sisters. They wore plain habits, often grey or brown, and lived under vows of chastity, obedience, and silence. The daily schedule mirrored that of a convent: prayers at fixed hours, communal meals of bread and soup, manual labour from dawn until dusk. The labour was relentless. In Marseille, the Magdalene house operated as a textile workshop, producing linen and wool cloth sold to fund the institution. In Rome, penitents washed laundry for hospitals and churches, their hands cracked from lye and cold water. The work was not optional. It was understood as penance, the physical expression of moral cleansing. The rules were strict and punitive. Speech was limited to necessity. Contact with the outside world was forbidden except under supervision. Letters were read by the Mother Superior. Visits from family were rare and required permission. Discipline for infractions ranged from fasting to solitary confinement in a cell without light or heat. Some houses imposed corporal punishment, flogging for repeated disobedience or attempts to leave. The stated goal was spiritual transformation, but the methods resembled those of a prison designed to break will rather than nurture it. Not all women stayed. Records from the Parisian house of Saint Magdalene show that roughly 1 in 4 penitents fled within the first year. Those caught were returned, sometimes in chains, and faced public humiliation before being readmitted under harsher conditions. Those who remained often did so because the alternative was starvation or a return to a trade that had aged them beyond the point of earning. The Magdalene house offered survival, but it was survival purchased with the surrender of autonomy. Marriage offered another path, though it was exceedingly rare. A former prostitute who wished to marry faced enormous obstacles. Canon law permitted it in theory, but social practice made it nearly impossible. The stigma was indelible. A woman known to have worked in a brothel was considered morally polluted, unfit to enter a respectable household, incapable of bearing the honor required of a wife. Most men of any standing would not consider such a match. The exceptions were found at the margins: widowers desperate for a housekeeper, labourers too poor to attract a dowry, disabled or disfigured men who had few other options. Charitable confraternities occasionally facilitated these marriages, motivated by a mix of piety and social order. In Florence, the confraternity of St. Mary Magdalene provided dowries to former prostitutes willing to marry and live honourably. The dowries were modest, usually enough to furnish a small household and pay the fees for a church wedding. The woman's past was acknowledged, but framed as redeemed through marriage and the sacrament. The groom received the dowry and the social credit of participating in an act of Christian charity. The woman received a legal identity as a wife, protection from further prosecution, and the possibility, though not the certainty, of a stable life. But the marriage was fragile. If the husband died, the widow often found herself without family support, unable to inherit property, and once again vulnerable to the accusation that she might return to her former trade. If the marriage failed, separation was nearly impossible without ecclesiastical annulment, a process expensive and rare, and even in successful marriages, the woman's past was never entirely forgotten. Neighbors remembered. Gossip circulated. Children born to such unions sometimes faced social exclusion, their legitimacy questioned, their mothers' histories weaponized against them. The religious ideal of the repentant Magdalene loomed large in all of this. Mary Magdalene, as constructed in medieval theology and hagiography, was the model of the sinner saved through tears, humility and devotion to Christ. Preachers held her up as proof that even the most degraded could be redeemed. Confraternities dedicated to her care funded hospitals, shelters, and dowries. The cult of the Magdalene was powerful and widespread, woven into the fabric of late medieval piety. But the ideal was also exploited. Moralizing literature portrayed reformed prostitutes as living lessons in the dangers of sin and the mercy of God. These stories almost always emphasized the woman's suffering, her degradation, and her absolute dependence on male and clerical intervention for salvation. The Magdalene was permitted redemption only if she performed contrition in ways that reinforced existing hierarchies. She could not simply leave the trade and live quietly. She had to repent publicly, labor endlessly, and accept her place as a permanent example of sin overcome. The narrative was never about her agency. It was about the power of the church and the benevolence of the institution that saved her. This rhetoric shaped the limited paths available to women who sought to leave. It ensured that exit from prostitution was conditional, supervised, and contingent on the approval of authorities who had often profited from the trade in the first place. The woman who entered a Magdalene house or married under the sponsorship of a confraternity was not free. She was transferred from one system of control to another, her body and labor redirected but not liberated. Some women found other ways. A few disappeared into domestic service, their pasts concealed through carefully managed silence and distance. Others migrated to new cities, taking on different names and identities. Though this required resources and connections most did not have. A handful entered less formal religious communities, third-order groups or beguinages where the rules were looser and the scrutiny less intense. But these were exceptions, glimpses of possibility within a structure designed to contain and limit. The majority remained in the trade until age, illness, or violence removed them. The paths out were not built for widespread use. They were designed to demonstrate the possibility of redemption, to offer visible proof of Christian mercy, and to manage the social anxieties surrounding women whose existence challenged the boundaries of respectable society. The exit was real enough for a few, but for most it remained a door too narrow to pass through, guarded by those who had no interest in opening it wider. Yet even as some women sought redemption, the trade itself remained embedded in urban life, its geography and daily rhythms part of the fabric of medieval cities. The physical world of medieval prostitution was not abstract. It existed in timber frames and stone thresholds, in rented rooms above taverns, in narrow passages between guild halls and marketplaces, in the regulated compounds at city edges where civic authority met bodily commerce. Space itself became a tool of control, a terrain shaped by law, economics, and the persistent anxiety that moral contamination might seep beyond its designated boundaries. To understand the trade is to map its geography, the rooms where women slept and worked, the streets where they solicited and were fined, the thresholds they could not cross without punishment. Every door, every zoning ordinance, every forbidden quarter told a story about power and survival. The regulated brothel, where it existed, was rarely grand. In cities like Avignon, Toulouse, and Dijon, These establishments occupied sturdy buildings, near but not within the most prestigious districts, close enough to serve demand yet removed from churches and respectable residential quarters. The architecture followed a pragmatic formula. A common room on the ground floor served as gathering space, where clients might drink, negotiate, and wait. Wooden benches lined the walls. Trestle tables bore earthenware cups and cheap wine. Firelight from a central hearth threw shadows across whitewashed plaster, and the air smelled of smoke, sweat, and the rushes scattered on packed dirt floors. This was not a place of comfort, only function. Above or behind the common room lay the sleeping quarters, typically small chambers partitioned with wooden screens or simple doors. Each might hold a narrow bed of rope and straw, a chest for clothing, a basin for washing. Privacy was minimal. Walls were thin. Noise travelled. The women who worked in these rooms paid rent to the brothel keeper, a sum extracted whether or not they earned enough to cover it. Debt accumulated quickly. Some brothels employed guards, men stationed at the entrance to manage clients, enforce payment, and prevent women from leaving without permission. These guards were not protectors in any meaningful sense. They were instruments of containment, ensuring that the women remained available and that profits flowed upward to the leaseholder and ultimately to the city treasury. The regulated brothel operated under civic license, bound by ordinances that specified hours, clientele, and conduct. In Toulouse, the municipal brothel known as the Château Gaillard functioned as a revenue source for the city council, which leased it to private operators. The women inside were subject to inspections, fines for misbehavior, and expulsion if they violated rules about dress or movement. The building itself became a symbol of civic pragmatism, a contained space where sin could be acknowledged, taxed, and theoretically controlled. Yet the architecture of control was never perfect. Women found ways to leave, to work independently, to resist the terms imposed on them. The brothel was a cage with cracks, and the streets beyond offered both danger and possibility. Street prostitution occupied a different geography entirely. Women who worked outside the licensed brothels, solicited in alleys, market squares, near city gates, and along the edges of parishes where enforcement was inconsistent. These were liminal spaces, thresholds between neighborhoods, zones of transit and commerce where anonymity and opportunity coexisted. In London, women gathered near the Thames, in Southwark, and along the lanes leading to Westminster. In Paris, they worked the approaches to bridges, the areas around Les Halles, the pathways near taverns and bathhouses. Civic patrols targeted these women relentlessly, imposing fines for soliciting outside permitted zones, for working without a license, for being visible in places where their presence offended civic sensibilities. The fines were rarely collected in full. Many women lacked the means to pay. Imprisonment or public humiliation followed. Yet the patrols continued, not because they stopped the trade, but because they reaffirmed boundaries. The act of enforcement mattered more than its success. A woman arrested for soliciting near a church, whipped and expelled from the city, served as public reminder that certain spaces remained off limits, that moral order required constant policing. The geography of the street trade was a geography of cat and mouse, of temporary invisibility and sudden exposure, of knowing which corners offered safety and which invited violence. Taverns and inns functioned as crucial nodes in this spatial network. These establishments offered food, drink, and lodging, but they also served as sites of negotiation and solicitation. A woman might enter a tavern alone or with a companion, sit near the fire, make eye contact with a traveller or local craftsman, and arrange terms over ale. The tavern keeper might tolerate this activity, even profit from it by renting rooms by the hour, or might call for civic guards if the arrangement threatened the establishment's reputation. The line was thin and constantly renegotiated. Violence erupted frequently in these spaces. Disputes over payment, drunken clients, rival pimps, and personal grievances turned tavern floors into scenes of assault. Women had little recourse. The tavern was public enough to be dangerous, but private enough that witnesses could claim ignorance. Inns along pilgrimage routes created a distinct market for transient sex work. The routes to Santiago de Compostela, to Rome, to Canterbury, drew thousands of pilgrims annually, and many inns catered to the needs of travelers far from home and familiar social constraints. Women worked these routes seasonally, moving between towns as pilgrimage traffic ebbed and flowed. The trade followed the rhythms of the liturgical calendar, busy during Lent and major feast days, quieter in winter. Civic authorities in pilgrimage towns faced a dilemma. They wanted the economic benefits of pilgrim traffic, but feared the moral disorder that accompanied it. Ordinances restricted where women could work, requiring them to stay outside city walls or in designated quarters. Enforcement varied wildly. Some towns expelled women wholesale before major festivals. Others tacitly allowed the trade to continue, collecting fines and licensing fees, while publicly condemning the sin. Fairs created similar conditions. The great commercial fairs of Champagne, of Frankfurt, of Laon drew merchants, artisans, and laborers from across Europe. These gatherings lasted days or weeks, temporary cities of canvas and timber, where normal social rules loosened. Women migrated to fairs seeking clients with ready coin. Some worked independently, others under the control of pimps who followed the fair circuit year after year. The temporary nature of the fair offered both opportunity and danger. A woman might earn more in a week than in a month of street work, but she also faced clients who knew they would never see her again, who felt emboldened by anonymity and ale. Violence at fairs was common and rarely prosecuted. The fair dissolved, people scattered, and justice evaporated with them. Urban planning itself encoded anxieties about contamination and order. Zoning ordinances prohibited brothels and known prostitutes from living near churches, monasteries, schools, and the homes of civic officials. In Venice, the magistracy designated specific neighborhoods where prostitutes could reside, attempting to concentrate the trade in areas that could be monitored and contained. The Rialto district became one such zone, its narrow streets and rented rooms home to women who paid fees to remain legally resident. In practice, these boundaries were porous. Women moved between zones, clients traveled to find them, and the fantasy of spatial containment remained just that. Yet the effort to control geography persisted. Every ordinance, every fine for crossing a boundary, every expulsion reinforced the idea that moral order could be mapped, that sin could be zoned and therefore managed. The architecture of control extended to physical markers within the urban landscape. Some cities required brothels to display identifying signs, a red lantern, a painted symbol, a particular color on the door. These markers functioned as warnings and advertisements simultaneously, alerting respectable citizens to avoid the area while informing clients where to find what they sought. The visual language of urban space became a code, readable to those who knew how to interpret it. A striped awning, a woman standing in a specific doorway, a tavern with no sign above the entrance, all conveyed information about the trade and its availability. The city itself became a text, written in stone and timber, enforced through fines and violence, navigated daily by women whose survival depended on knowing which streets to walk and when. The geography of the trade revealed a fundamental tension. Civic authorities wanted prostitution contained, visible, and taxable, yet they also wanted it hidden from view, expelled from sacred and respectable spaces, erased from the moral landscape of Christendom. These goals were incompatible. Regulation required visibility, control demanded boundaries, revenue depended on access. The result was a patchwork of ordinances, a shifting map of permitted and forbidden zones, and a population of women who learned to navigate the cracks between law and enforcement, between tolerance and persecution. The trade was not static. It shifted over time, shaped by plague, war, economic change, and the rising tide of civic moralism that began to turn against it in the late 15th century. The machinery of regulation, for all its brutality and exploitation, had operated for nearly 3 centuries on a foundation of uneasy consensus. Cities taxed brothels, churchmen quoted Augustine, and women endured the terms imposed upon them. Yet by the final decades of the 1500s, this system began to collapse under pressures both material and ideological. Disease arrived with a virulence that seemed apocalyptic. Moral reform movements gained political force. What had been tolerated as necessary evil became intolerable sin, and the women who had survived within the cracks of civic pragmatism found those cracks sealing shut. The disease that would reshape European attitudes toward prostitution appeared first in Naples in 1494, brought by soldiers in the army of Charles VIII of France during his invasion of the Italian peninsula. Within months, it spread through military camps, port cities, and trade routes with a speed that terrified observers. The symptoms were grotesque: pustules that covered the body, lesions that ate through flesh and bone, fevers that lasted weeks, and a progression that could lead to madness and death. Physicians had no name for it at first. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. The Italians called it the French disease. Later generations would know it as syphilis after a Latin poem written in 1530 that personified the illness as divine punishment for moral transgression. The poem's protagonist, a shepherd named Syphilis, blasphemed against the gods and was struck down with pustules and pain. It was not subtle allegory. Medical writers struggled to understand the transmission and nature of the infection. Some believed it traveled through corrupt air, others through poisoned water or the alignment of planets. A German physician named Joseph Grunpeck, writing in 1496, described it as a scourge sent by God to punish the sins of fornication and adultery. This interpretation gained rapid acceptance, not because the evidence supported it, but because it fit existing moral narratives about sexual sin and divine retribution. Prostitutes, already marked as morally polluted, became scapegoats. The fact that the disease spread through sexual contact made the connection seem obvious, though syphilis infected wives, husbands, and children, born to infected mothers just as readily. Logic mattered less than the need to identify a cause and a culpable population. Cities responded with measures that ranged from medical inspection to outright expulsion. In 1500, the city of Paris ordered the closure of public bathhouses, which had long served as sites of both hygiene and sexual commerce. Prostitutes were barred from entering the city walls. In 1512, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian issued an edict ordering the expulsion of all public women from imperial territories, citing the spread of disease and the need to restore moral order. Venice, which had regulated prostitution with relative pragmatism for centuries, began imposing harsher penalties and restricting the movements of women suspected of carrying infection. Brothels that had operated openly under civic license found their leases revoked. The women who had paid taxes and worn the mandated yellow scarves were suddenly criminal, their bodies not just marked but dangerous. The arrival of syphilis coincided with a broader shift in religious and civic attitudes toward public morality. The late 1500s saw the rise of reform movements within the Catholic Church, driven by anxieties about corruption, heresy, and the perceived moral decay of Christendom. Savonarola in Florence had already preached fiery sermons against vice and luxury in the 1490s, organizing bonfires of vanities where citizens burned cosmetics, mirrors, and books deemed immoral. His followers targeted prostitutes with particular zeal, harassing them in the streets and demanding their expulsion from the city. Though Savonarola himself was executed in 1498, the moral fervor he represented did not die with him. It spread through confraternities, preaching orders, and civic councils that saw the regulation of sexuality as central to the health of the body politic. Protestant reformers in the early 1600s intensified these attitudes. Martin Luther, in his writings on marriage and sexuality, condemned prostitution as a product of Catholic hypocrisy and corruption. He argued that the toleration of brothels under papal authority proved the moral bankruptcy of the Roman Church. Cities that embraced the Reformation often closed their brothels as acts of religious purification. In 1520, the city of Augsburg shuttered its municipal brothel and expelled the women who had worked there. In 1532, the city of Strasbourg did the same. The closures were not mere symbolic gestures. They represented a fundamental shift in how civic authorities understood their role. Where once they had managed vice, now they sought to eliminate it. The practical consequences for women were immediate and severe. Those who had worked in licensed brothels lost not only their income but also the limited protections that regulation had provided. Without legal status, they could not appeal to magistrates for protection from violence or theft. Many were arrested, fined, or subjected to public humiliation. In some cities, repeat offenders were branded, whipped, or banished under threat of death if they returned. The Magdalene houses that had once offered refuge became overcrowded and more punitive in their regimes. Women who refused or were unable to enter these institutions faced destitution. Street prostitution, already dangerous, became far more so. Without the structure of licensed brothels, women negotiated directly with clients in alleys, taverns, and rented rooms. Pimps and procuresses adapted to the new conditions, operating clandestinely and extracting higher percentages of earnings in exchange for protection and access to clients. Debt bondage intensified. Women who had once paid fees to civic authorities now paid extortion to criminal networks. The shift from regulation to prohibition did not reduce prostitution. It drove it underground, where violence flourished and legal recourse vanished entirely. Economic pressures compounded the crisis. The early 1600s saw inflation, harvest failures, and the social disruptions caused by religious wars. Poverty pushed more women into the trade even as cities criminalized their survival strategies. Some turned to theft or begging. Others migrated to smaller towns or rural areas where enforcement was less rigorous. A few found marriages or positions in domestic service, though the stigma of past work followed them. For many, the closure of brothels meant a descent into deeper marginalization, moving from one temporary refuge to another, always one arrest or assault away from catastrophe. The shift in legal and moral frameworks also changed how communities understood and discussed prostitution. The language of necessary evil gave way to rhetoric of contagion and contamination. Women who sold sex were no longer unfortunate but necessary. They were vectors of disease and agents of moral corruption. This rhetorical shift made violence against them more socially acceptable. It also erased the economic and structural causes that had driven women into the trade in the first place. The closure of brothels was presented as moral reform, but it solved nothing. It simply redistributed suffering and removed what limited protections had existed. By the mid-1600s, the era of regulated municipal prostitution had largely ended in northern Europe. In southern France and parts of Italy, some brothels persisted into the 17th century, though under increasing scrutiny and with diminished civic support. The Southwark stews in London, which had operated under the Bishop of Winchester's jurisdiction for centuries, were closed by royal proclamation in 1546. The physical structures remained for a time, repurposed as tenements or warehouses, their original function fading from memory. The women who had worked within them left no monuments and few records. What survived were court documents listing fines and expulsions, church registers noting deaths and baptisms, and the occasional archaeological trace of a building foundation or buried refuse pit. The end of regulated prostitution did not mark the end of the trade itself, only a transformation in how it operated and how society punished those who engaged in it. The structures of exploitation adapted, the women endured. The disease spread regardless of moral proclamations or civic ordinances. Syphilis would remain endemic in Europe for centuries, its treatment a matter of mercury poisoning and prayer, until the development of antibiotics in the 20th century. The moral panic it inspired in the late 1500s left a legacy of criminalization and stigma that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. What remains today are traces in records, laws, and the archaeological remnants of brothels and Magdalene houses, reminders of a world where survival often meant negotiating the harshest terms society could impose. The historical record of medieval prostitution is written almost entirely by those who condemned, regulated, or profited from it. Court clerks recorded arrests and fines. Civic officials drafted statutes defining permissible zones and mandated clothing. Church scribes copied sermons and penitential manuals. Medical writers described disease. Moralizing poets and preachers deployed the figure of the prostitute as metaphor for urban corruption or spiritual decay. What survives is an archive of control, judgment, and economic extraction. The voices of the women themselves are nearly silent, mediated through the pens of men who rarely asked what they thought, felt, or wanted. To reconstruct their lives requires reading against the grain of hostile sources, searching for traces in the margins of documents written for entirely different purposes, and acknowledging the vast stretches of experience that remain unknowable. Court records provide the most detailed glimpses, though always through the lens of prosecution. In Dijon, municipal registers from the 1430s through the 1470s record dozens of cases involving women accused of working outside the licensed brothel or violating sumptuary laws. These entries note names, sometimes ages, occasionally places of origin. They describe punishments, fines, public whippings, expulsion, branding. A woman named Perenelle was fined 6 sous in 1441 for soliciting near the Church of Notre Dame. Another, Ginette, was banished in 1453 after a third offence. The records are terse, bureaucratic, concerned only with the infraction and the penalty. They do not explain why Perenelle stood outside that particular church, whether she had children, what she did after the fine was paid. They offer only the moment of collision between a woman's survival strategy and the civic order determined to contain it. Civic statutes provide the framework but not the texture. The ordinances of Avignon, Venice, Toulouse, and London specify where prostitutes could live, what they could wear, when they could walk the streets. They define penalties for violating curfews or entering certain neighborhoods. They establish fees for brothel leases and the conditions under which licenses could be revoked. These laws reveal the priorities of urban governments: maintaining order, extracting revenue, protecting the reputations of respectable women, and preventing moral contamination from spreading beyond designated zones. They say nothing about the women's own understanding of their circumstances, their relationships with one another, or the strategies they use to navigate a system designed to exploit them. The statutes are maps of power, not of experience. Church registers and moralizing literature add theological weight but little human detail. Penitential manuals list prostitution among sins requiring confession and penance, sometimes distinguishing between women who entered the trade voluntarily and those coerced by poverty or violence. Sermons use the figure of the prostitute as a symbol of urban vice, or as an example of redemption through repentance, invoking Mary Magdalene as the model of transformed sin. These texts are prescriptive, concerned with souls and moral categories, not with the material conditions of daily life. They tell us how the church wanted prostitutes to be seen and treated, but they do not capture the lived reality of negotiating with a pimp, fearing a violent client, or deciding whether to risk leaving the trade. The woman becomes archetype, flattened into doctrine. Medical treatises from the 14th and 15th centuries describe sexually transmitted infections and their symptoms, sometimes attributing their spread to prostitutes. These texts blend observation with moral judgment, framing disease as both a physical affliction and a punishment for sin. They offer remedies, mercury ointments, herbal poultices, bloodletting, that were largely ineffective and often painful. The women who suffered these infections appear as patients or vectors, not as individuals. The treatises document suffering, but do not give voice to it. They record the body's breakdown without acknowledging the person inhabiting it. Archaeology offers a different kind of evidence, material rather than textual, and it has begun to fill some of the silence. Excavations of brothel sites in cities like Avignon, London, and Cologne have uncovered foundations, floor plans, and the detritus of daily life. At Southwark, investigations of the medieval stews revealed densely packed buildings along the Thames, with narrow rooms opening onto communal courtyards. Pottery shards, animal bones, and fragments of leather shoes suggest modest material conditions, though not the extreme poverty sometimes imagined. Coins found in drain channels and middens hint at the flow of money through these spaces, small denominations mingling with the refuse of domestic life. The buildings themselves were not luxurious but functional, built for efficiency rather than comfort. Thick walls separated rooms, offering minimal privacy. Hearths provided heat, essential in drafty wooden structures during winter months. These sites also reveal violence. At one excavation in southern France, skeletal remains of young women were found in shallow graves adjacent to a known brothel district. Forensic analysis indicated signs of trauma, fractured ribs, healed breaks, evidence of malnutrition and chronic illness. Some showed indications of repeated pregnancies, The bones speak to lives shaped by physical hardship and danger, though they cannot tell us names, thoughts, or the moments of tenderness or defiance that might have punctuated the suffering. Material culture provides texture but not narrative. It confirms the harshness described in legal sources but cannot restore individual agency or voice. The challenge of reconstructing experience from fragmentary hostile sources is methodological and ethical. Historians must resist the temptation to project modern categories or sentiments onto medieval women whose worldviews were shaped by entirely different belief systems, economic structures, and social possibilities. Empathy cannot substitute for evidence. At the same time, the absence of direct testimony does not mean these women were passive or lacked complexity. Court records occasionally capture moments of resistance, a woman arguing with a magistrate, another fleeing before sentencing, a third negotiating a reduced fine. These glimpses suggest calculation, self-preservation, and the exercise of constrained choice within a system offering few good options. The women were not victims devoid of agency, nor were they free actors in any meaningful sense. They navigated structures of power that were overwhelmingly stacked against them, making decisions shaped by hunger, debt, violence, and the ever-present threat of destitution. What the sources make abundantly clear is the persistence of structural forces across centuries. Poverty drove women into the trade in the 12th century as it did in the 15th. Patriarchy limited their economic alternatives before and after the Black Death. Legal marginalization made them vulnerable to violence regardless of whether they worked in licensed brothels or on the streets. Wars, famines, and plagues created waves of displacement that swelled the ranks of sex workers, but the underlying conditions remained constant. The specific regulations changed. Brothels opened and closed, dress codes varied, moral panics rose and fell, but the mechanisms of exploitation endured. Women sold sex because they needed to survive, and the systems designed to regulate them prioritized order and revenue over safety or dignity. The silences in the archive are not accidental. Medieval society did not value the testimony of women deemed morally compromised. It did not seek their perspectives or preserve their words. What survives is the machinery of control and the traces left when that machinery encountered resistance or broke down. Historians work with what remains, assembling fragments into partial reconstructions, always aware that the most important questions, what did she think? What did she want? How did she endure? May never have complete answers. The archive is a record of power, not of personhood, and every conclusion drawn from it carries the weight of what cannot be known. Yet even within these constraints, patterns emerge. The economic precarity of women across medieval Europe, the use of law to mark, contain, and extract value from stigmatized bodies, the everyday violence that accompanied marginalization, the rare moments of escape, and the high cost of redemption. These patterns reveal not individual lives, but the contours of a system that spanned centuries and geographies, adapting to local conditions while maintaining its essential character. The women who lived within it left few words, but the structures that shaped their lives are etched into the historical record with brutal clarity.